7 Appalachian horror stories. There's a reason so many horror stories come out of Appalachia. It's a region built on hollers and ridgelines where the nearest neighbor might be a mile off through dense trees, where families have passed down stories for generations instead of writing them in any book, and where a lot of small towns still don't have cell service past the last gas station. Isolation does something to a place. It lets stories take root and grow in the dark for years before anyone outside ever hears them. Here are 7 stories from deep in the mountains, the kind that get told around a fire and never quite explained. The first one happened in a coal town in West Virginia that had mostly emptied out by the time Daniel Pruitt moved back in to take care of his aging grandmother. The house sat at the end of a gravel road, backed up against a ridge so steep that nothing grew on it but scrub pine. His grandmother warned him the first night not to go walking the tree line after dark, saying only that the ridge wasn't right after sundown, and refusing to explain further no matter how many times he asked. 2 weeks in, Daniel ignored her and took a walk near the tree line just after dusk to clear his head. He said later that the woods went completely silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. The kind of silence that felt deliberate. Then he heard something breathing behind him, slow and deep, close enough that he could feel it on the back of his neck. He didn't turn around. He ran the entire way back to the house and didn't stop until the door was locked behind him. When he told his grandmother what happened, she didn't seem surprised. She just nodded and said that was the last time he'd be going near that ridge after dark, and he never did again. In a hollow outside a small town in eastern Kentucky, a young couple named Wade and Ellen bought an old farmhouse for almost nothing, mostly because it had sat empty for over a decade and nobody local wanted it. The first few months were fine. Then Ellen started noticing that the family photographs on the mantle would occasionally be turned face down in the morning, all of them at once, even though the house was locked overnight and nothing else was ever disturbed. Wade assumed it was some kind of draft knocking them over until one morning they found all 7 photos not just face down but stacked into a single neat pile in the center of the mantle, something a draft could never do. They asked around town and an older neighbor told them, almost reluctantly, that the family who lived there before had lost a child in the house decades earlier, and that the mother had spent her last years turning every photograph of the family away from the wall where the child used to sleep. Wade and Ellen never got a clear answer for why it started again the moment they moved in, and neither of them ever slept easily in that house again. Further south, in the mountains of North Carolina, a hunter named Roy Ferris was tracking a deer trail well past dark, farther from his truck than he meant to go. He said the forest around him went unnaturally quiet, the same kind of silence Daniel had described up in West Virginia, and that he felt certain something large was moving parallel to him, just out of sight in the brush. He caught a glimpse of it once, low to the ground and moving on all fours, but faster than any 4-legged animal he'd ever hunted, gone before his flashlight beam fully landed on it. Roy is not a man who spooks easily, and he'd grown up hearing stories about something the older folks in his family called the Wampus Cat, a creature said to roam those same ridges for over a century. He never got a clean look at whatever was pacing him that night. He made it back to his truck and drove straight home, and he hasn't hunted alone after dark since. In a small town along the Virginia-Tennessee border, an elderly widow named Opal Hensley lived alone in a house her husband built decades earlier, right at the base of a mountain locals had always called haunted ground, though nobody could say exactly why anymore. Opal always said she could hear something walking on her roof most nights, footsteps far too heavy and far too rhythmic to be a raccoon or a possum, and always coming from the same direction, moving from the back of the house toward the front. Her grown children assumed it was just an old woman's imagination for years, until one of her sons stayed overnight to check on her and heard it himself. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing directly above his head at almost 3 a.m. He went outside to look and found nothing on the roof and no ladder or tree close enough for anything to climb up. Opal passed away peacefully a few years later, and according to her son, the footsteps stopped completely the same week she died and were never heard again. A logging crew working a remote section of forest in southern West Virginia in the 1980s used to tell a story about a co-worker named Harlan who went missing for almost 2 full days after wandering off from camp to relieve himself one evening. When he stumbled back into camp on the second night, disoriented and badly scratched up, He swore he'd been led deeper and deeper into the woods by what he described as a small child's voice calling for help, always staying just out of sight no matter how far he followed it. He said that every time he got close enough to see something, it would move again, always a little farther into the trees until it was fully dark and he had no idea which direction led back to camp. The rest of the crew searched for him with flashlights and never heard a single voice, child's or otherwise, the entire time he was missing. Harlan refused to work night shifts again after that, and the story got passed down through logging crews in that area for years afterward as a warning never to chase a voice you can't see the source of. In the Great Smoky Mountains, a group of backpackers making a multi-day trek came across an old family cemetery tucked into a clearing far off the marked trail, with headstones so worn down that most of the names were no longer readable. They made camp nearby for the night without thinking much of it. Around 2 a.m., one of them woke up to the unmistakable sound of digging, rhythmic and steady, coming from the direction of the cemetery. Two of the group got up to check, using their headlamps to scan the clearing, and found the ground completely undisturbed. No fresh dirt, no tools, nothing. The digging sound continued anyway, seemingly coming from directly beneath their feet at times, for almost 20 minutes before it stopped as suddenly as it started. None of them slept the rest of the night, and they broke camp before sunrise, hiking out a full day earlier than they'd planned. None of the group has ever camped near an unmarked cemetery since. The last story comes from a small mining community in eastern Tennessee, where a woman named Ruth Caldwell used to babysit for a neighboring family in a house built directly over what had once been part of an old mine shaft, sealed off decades before anyone in the family was even born. She said that some nights, usually well past midnight, she could hear what sounded like men's voices coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards, talking low and indistinct, occasionally followed by what she swore was the sound of a pickaxe striking rock. The family who lived there had heard it too, and had simply learned to live with it, telling Ruth matter-of-factly that the mine below the house had partially collapsed generations ago, trapping several miners who were never recovered. They said the sounds had been happening for as long as anyone in the family could remember, and had long since stopped being frightened by it, treating it almost like a strange kind of company. Ruth babysat for that family for 2 more years and said she got used to the voices too, though she admitted she never once worked up the nerve to actually listen closely enough to make out what they were saying. 7 stories, 7 different corners of the same mountain range, and not one of them ends with a clean explanation. That's the thing about these hollers. The trees are old, the towns are small, and the stories have had a very long time to grow roots of their own.